Hey everyone, I'm Ivan. This will probably lean on the more like history slash theory of the talks today, but super excited to chat about this. So my kind of fascination and love for Chinese type recently came about when I was traveling in Taiwan. And if you're a fan of this creature, Bugcat Kapu, there's a 7-Eleven in Taiwan that literally sells Bugcat Kapu merch. But I was really enamored by this juxtaposition of the Chinese type versus the English type, mostly because it's so like bouncy and graphic and also really reflects the personality. And I've just been like fascinated in thinking about how do we balance these kind of systems together today. And so, yeah, a little bit about me. I'm Ivan. I make websites, animations, comics, but I'm just sort of like fascinated in this whole world of sort of like how do we make weird things on the internet and how do we communicate and create tools and infrastructure to do so. And so, if you've ever taken kind of like a history of graphic design, or anyone has ever talked to you about type design, there's a very, very famous book in the mid 15th century called the Gutenberg Bible that everyone loves to sort of like pontificate on and think about, like, look at this sort of like medieval scripture, look at these really beautiful drop caps, think about this like black lettering. I'm actually here to tell you that you should completely get rid of the Gutenberg Bible. And in the famous book, Patricia Lockwood's, no one is talking about Chinese writing systems. And so the history of printing kind of stems back into 11th century China with this worker commoner named Bishang, who in mid 11th century created one of the first examples of printmaking. And so in Chinese history, there are four notable kind of inventions, and printmaking is one of them, made in the 11th century. And so this is a old bank statement made at the time using wooden movable type. And one of the things that's really interesting about this, if you look at kind of the entirety of the Chinese history and sort of like Chinese writing system, is that it, compared to the Latin script, is very sort of like pictographical, logographical. Scholars are kind of debating on what exactly the terms are, but here you can see at like the top that all of these sort of like representations started as the original image. You can kind of see on the left hand side, there's this progression of what like a horse looks like, starts very as much the image of the horse, and all the way we get down to the simplified script that's what being used today. I think what's super fascinating about this as well is that the when you look at it, the current standard for Chinese language in China, GB, I think 2300, is used in 5% of websites. Um, but during the time when this was happening, the simplification, one of the things about the Chinese language is that there's an old traditional script, which you see as kind of like the standard script, versus the simplified script. And that happened during the 1950s, where Chairman Mao and the CCP and the Communist Party in China wanted to improve the literacy rates of the Chinese people. The literacy rates were super abysmal. I think more than 90% of people at the time were like unable to read, and they were like, okay, it's really complicated. I mean, if you've ever tried to learn East Asian language slash like character based language, you know, there's just like so many things to learn. And so they were like, how do we make this easier? How do we incorporate this into a modernized world? How do we think about this? And so coming here, we also have like this is an example of just wooden movable type, kind of emphasizing, if you've ever worked with printmaking or letterpress, you would know that you have in the Latin script, you have like all these glyphs that you can represent to make words. But for the Chinese language and all East Asian languages, you have to have all the individual characters. And so this is kind of just an example of like how much stuff you would need, which is really terrifying. Um, and even in the modernization of it, when people were thinking about typewriters and printing presses, it's like, what would this even look like? And so this was just like a speculative sketch of a typewriter. And so it's like you have all of these characters mapped out onto it. The average Chinese dictionary has about 60,000 to 80,000 words. Like a body font for a Chinese font would require you to have about 8,000 words, but that doesn't take into case differences in both simplified and traditional. So it's just like there's a lot that you have to deal with, and there's a lot of history that's associated with this. There's also a lot of like political structures. One thing specifically is that in this example, the Chinese language is comprised of individual radicals, and so radicals and also characters are composed of both traditional and simplified. And so here, this radical means speech. And so one of the things in the basis for the Chinese language is that it's composed of these various radicals that add up to sort of give meaning to this character. And so you can kind of see all of the characters above have this like speech radical, and they all have words that are related or have meanings that are related to speech creation, word creation, or sort of like communication. This is not like ubiquitously true across the language, but it is one thing that's really interesting to consider when you think about sort of comprising and creating the Chinese language as a whole, especially from a type design perspective, where you want to sort of like componentize all of these characters. But one thing you'll also notice in this kind of creation is that you have to make different components for each specific one. For example, even in the character on the right for talking fast top, there's two of these small, sort of smaller radicals on the bottom, and then this one larger radical on the top. And so you even within these components have to make different subcomponents. And so I think this is like a really interesting and like theoretical approach when you consider to like how you make UI abstractions or thinking about the ways that components exist in UI, where it's like, is there a way that this could exist for font software and making it a lot easier for Chinese? This is a example of what the kind of like traditional versus simplified dichotomy looks to. One of the main things to consider here is that in traditional versus simplified, there's kind of like political ramifications around the two, where traditional is a lot more present in places such as Macau, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and used in other locations, while simplified is mainly existing in the mainland. That's for another conversation, but something to keep in mind if you ever have to do localization is just to like dig into it specifically where you're thinking about creating those languages for. And so now a little bit into classifications of Chinese writing systems. So the way that we have type systems kind of as like sans serif, serif as like kind of the basic definitions and like italicize and all this stuff. Chinese also has this in their fonts as well. And so this is called Songti, which is based off of historical precedents in the Song Dynasty after the name Songti. And so it alludes to this kind of like more calligraphic nature. You can kind of see on the right hand character there are these like large flat stems. There's this kind of like flourish at the end that is indicative of a very like calligraphic slash like old style. And so this is what we would consider kind of like a serif in the Chinese world. Next up, we have this thing called Heiti, which translates to like black lettering or just like black body. And so this more represents kind of like the sans serif world, and this rose to prominence mainly in the late 2000s as a result of increased like digitization, where it was like, how do we make these characters like easier to read online? We also have this thing called kaiti, which is another calligraphic notion, less ingrained in sort of older historical periods, but has some of the same flourishes. Um, and the fourth one, we have something called feng songti, which is a mix of this kind of like old songti and this like calligraphic notion. So you can see here, as compared to the one in the past, we have these like little flourishes and like more sort of like softer notes. And so this kind of gives more of like a different writing style slash like I think in terms of the bamboo like pen nib that you would potentially be using. And one of these things also is kind of a classification is called Meishu Ti, which is translate to kind of like artistic like display or artistic font. And typically it describes this like world of display fonts and like display lettering that's like super fun, very bouncy, sort of like hard to define. And I think like I'm personally like really interested in this because it's like all those things can be done really well, but it's like where are the things that have a lot of personality and sort of depth to them. And so, how do you actually use this? The default set for an English language font contains about like 230 glyphs. If you have Latin scripts, that's 840 glyphs. In Chinese, you have to make a lot of glyphs. And so, what happens with this is that the size of your font file becomes really, really large and becomes really kind of like almost terrible to use. And there's also the fact that in China, there's different character encoding methods that are primarily used as well. But luckily, thanks to the Unicode Consortium, you can just ignore all of that and just use the Unicode UTF-8, which will always work for you, given the sort of as long as your font file is well defined within kind of the font file specifications. And so you can always use that. UTF is primarily and supports all of the Chinese characters that exist out in the world. But luckily, when you use this, you can actually just define the font family inside your CSS like this. One of the things to consider is that when you're defining these, you want to put both the romanization and the Chinese characters' names of it, just in case you don't know which one it's going to map to. So you want to put that as a fallback, and you also want to always define your Latin language CSS font family first. There's some interesting stuff being done in the Taiwanese world. This is a site called Yozacool, which literally translates to there exists like a font library. Like we have a font library, which I think is really funny. And they have this like kind of experimental API that allows you to fetch for a WebP file that provides all of these glyphs for you. And what that also does is it reads your web page to check which glyphs are actually needed and will only send you the corresponding glyphs in that font file so that they can be rendered correctly, thus decreasing the size of it as well. Um, this is sort of a reference for if you ever want free fonts, free Chinese fonts, because they're really hard to get to and really hard to find and make. Um, this is a great GitHub for it called WordsHub Free Font. And one of the things to also notice is that when you look at these Chinese fonts, all of them in the beginning have the denotation of what foundry made them. So this is Fangzheng, which means it's kind of like founder is the name of it. And so all of these are founder type foundries of the various different types of styles I made. So you can see there's Heiti, which is like the sans serifs, and then the Shuti, which is kind of like the calligraphic notion. One of the other great things in CSS is you can use this writing mode that allows you to write from vertical right to left, support more traditional native reading top down, right to left Chinese writing. You also have this really great thing called font variant East Asian, which is specifically for East Asian languages and East Asian scripts. And so you can move between normal and traditional. And then one of the other things to obviously mention as a side note is that Notif Sans, which is a project by Google and Adobe, exists to kind of provide language scripts across the world. And so how do we feel about Notif? We think that Noto belongs in the trash, and I think that you should go out and look for other interesting things. And so really quickly, just some examples of kind of like fonts in use of like what can you actually do with this, or how do you actually pair it with Latin scripts? This is a comparison of what Heiti and Songti look like together. There's a project done by Julius Hui who did the Chinese rebranding of the New York Times, and he uses this really beautiful like black letter Songti, kind of alluding to the same New York Times motif, and uses the same like stem slash notion for this as well. One of the funniest things, if you've been following along in the three body problem discourse, is that the serif used in the banner for the Communist Party, like everyone in sort of China was pissed because it needed to be a heavier weight. And you can kind of see on the bottom right-hand corner here of what that weight should look like. So now with this knowledge, you can also argue about the issues in the three body problem. Here's a really great example from the Taiwan Design Expo. I love the sort of like constrained slash like put together use of the Latin type that has these like weird like ink traps slash like contrasts, and together with the more traditional notions of the characters. Here's a piece by Ding Yi, who did the Chinese brand identity for Alice in Wonderland, and you can kind of see these like lovely little serifs piecing together with the original Alice in Wonderland characters. Here's another poster by a Shenzhen graphic designer who takes the original character and uses the lines and the glyphs as individual shapes. And just a couple more examples. One thing I also wanted to mention in the sort of like vein of like fun indie programming, you can make your own Chinese esoteric language. So this is Wenyan Lang, which is written in the script of sort of like old Chinese languages and programs and compiles to both JavaScript, Ruby, and C, I think. But you can literally write programs in Chinese if you wanted to. And the great thing about it is that since it's all defined on a grid structure, you can always, they're all like monospaced by default. So like that whole problem is solved for you. Lastly, just wanted to sort of end with this talk of, this is the characters for jiayou in Chinese, which means to add oil, but encourage everyone sort of to, if there's any interest, dig into these things, look at Chinese characters, think about different scripts in the world and how you can use them to benefit your own designs and your own sites. So thank you.